our hunting, camping trip from hell. My friend James and I had promised never to speak about what happened on that hunting trip, but I've come to feel that sharing it might help me move on. I spoke with James about it, and while he was hesitant, he eventually agreed that it probably wouldn't hurt. I'm going to include as much detail as I can, just in case any of you pick up on something we missed. I've changed our names, but everyone else's remains the same. At the time, I had just quit my job and started a course. I'd grown tired of that line of work and wanted to get a proper qualification, something I'd never done since I didn't go to university, something I'd always regretted. James runs a small business that slows down in the winter, so he had some free time too. My private college shuts down twice a year, and I was on a break, so we figured it was the perfect time to try to fill our freezers with venison, since neither of us had shot a deer yet that year. We had both recently received our R license, which allows hunting in state forests across New South Wales, NSW, Australia. These forests typically include sections of pine plantations managed by the government-owned Forestry Corporation. There are hundreds of such forests in NSW, covering millions of acres. We chose Mont David State Forest, a 16,615 area on the far side of the Blue Mountains, based on good reports from several friends. They'd seen both wild pigs and fallow deer there. So we planned our trip. On a frosty Friday morning in July, remember, it's winter in the southern hemisphere, we set off on what was meant to be a 4-day hunt. The drive was great. We spent a few hours chatting about life and reminiscing about previous hunting trips. Once we got close to the forest, mobile reception dropped out, which wasn't surprising, as most hunting areas are outside coverage zones. It was around 11 a.m. by then. The drive had taken longer than expected because James is addicted to coffee and seems to have the world's smallest bladder. We must have stopped at least 3 times. We'd been on dirt roads for several kilometers when we started seeing the first pine plantations, but we weren't exactly sure where to turn, so we kept following what we thought was the entry road. That's when the first strange thing happened. We rounded a bend and saw a man sitting in a ute. That's a pickup truck for any Americans reading, with a massive dog in the back. It was odd. There hadn't been another vehicle for miles, yet here he was, drinking a beer in the late morning. It felt like he was waiting for something or someone. I mean, who just parks on a remote dirt road in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the day, doing absolutely nothing? We slowly pulled up beside him, gave a casual day, and asked if he knew where the entry to the forest was. He looked to be in his 60s, had a thick gray beard, a full set of teeth, and was wearing a dark blue jumper, what we Aussies call a sloppy joe, along with a pair of blue jeans. He started chatting about how there had been some deer around lately, just the usual small talk you make with strangers out in the bush, while casually sipping his beer. After about 10 minutes of conversation, he offered to show us where the entry to the forest was. As we followed him, James commented on how strange it was to come across someone just sitting on the road in the middle of nowhere, and how he seemed a bit too eager to help. I pointed out that we were out in the country, and people are generally more laid back and friendly. Once we entered the forest, the man pulled over again, and we drove up beside him. That's when we properly introduced ourselves. He said his name was Slim. I told him I was Kevin and introduced James. Then he offered to show us around the forest and suggest a place we could camp. I thanked him and said we'd be fine, but he was persistent, almost insistent, so I went along with it, mostly to be polite. As we followed him through the pine plantations, the towering trees, easily 20 to 30 meters high, cast heavy shadows that made it feel like dusk, even though it was still daytime. It gave the place an eerie, unsettling atmosphere. That's when James leaned over and said, "There is no fucking way we're camping where he suggested. We don't know who this guy is. All our gear is here. What if he just wants to know where we're staying so he can come back and steal our stuff? I could see his point, but at the time, I just figured Slim was a lonely old guy who was glad to have some company for change. During the half-hour or so drive, Slim would occasionally stop to point out what he said were good campsites. Eventually, he showed us a large open clearing and said that's where most people set up camp. By the time the tour was over, we were ready to get things set up ourselves. We had already agreed not to camp in any of the places he showed us, especially not the clearing, just in case our gear ended up getting stolen. We thanked him repeatedly, but just as he was about to get back into his car, he paused and asked, "So where do you think you blokes will camp?" I didn't know what to say and just kept quiet, but James quickly replied, "Mate, we're not sure yet. We'll probably have a drive around a bit more and figure it out later today. Won't take us long to set up once we've had a better look." Slim's tone shifted. "I really think you blokes should camp in the clearing. That's where every other mongrel camps," he said firmly. At that point, Slim seemed to get a bit agitated. He narrowed his eyes and locked eyes with James. "Well, you bloody well better hurry up and decide," he snapped. "It gets mighty dark and cold mighty quick in this forest, so you pair will want to get nice and bloody warm." James calmly thanked him for the advice, and we waited until Slim drove off before saying anything. Sitting in the car, James leaned over and whispered, "What the fuck, man?" I just shrugged, feeling way more uncomfortable than I had a minute earlier. Once we were sure Slim was gone, we started searching for a hidden spot to camp, somewhere he hadn't shown us. After what felt like forever driving up and down the forestry roads, scratching the hell out of my year-old 4x4 on blackberry bushes and other scrub, we finally came across a narrow track that led about 50 meters into the forest. It opened into a small clearing. The best part? It couldn't be seen from any road. We were happy with that. We set up camp. James had his dome swag and tarp, and I had a new dome tent that I hadn't used before, so it took a bit to get right. Inside the tent, I laid out my flat swag for bedding. When everything was done, I stood back, looked at the setup, and thought it looked great, so I snapped a photo with my phone. That photo would later end up saving our asses from spending a night out in sub-zero temperatures with nothing but our hunting gear. With camp finally ready, we checked the maps I downloaded to my phone to find the no hunting zones and plan out where we'd go. Once we had a plan, we loaded our rifles and set off, walking away from camp. After a solid scouting session, we saw almost nothing, except for one feral sheep that had managed to get itself tangled in some blackberry bushes. We freed it, and it bolted off toward the edge of the pine plantation. With daylight starting to fade, we decided it was best to head back to camp. Confident in our sense of direction, we made our way to where we thought camp was, only to find nothing. No worries, we figured. We must have missed the track. Let's do a lap around and try again. We ended up walking and searching for over 3 hours. Thankfully, we had our headlamps, which made things a little easier. Well, we were still lost, but at least we had light, which gave us some comfort. Eventually, we switched down to using just one headlamp to save battery. James was starting to lose his patience, and rightly so. He was pissed that I hadn't marked a GPS waypoint for the camp using my phone's GPS app. I was frantically holding my phone in the air, searching for even the slightest signal so I could pull up Google Earth and figure out where we were in relation to the clearing we'd chosen. But no luck. Then it hit me. I'd taken a photo of the camp earlier, and that photo should have GPS metadata embedded in it. Fortunately, the app we were required to use, PDF Maps, had a feature that lets you import images. I found the option, imported the photo, and just like that, we had a waypoint to navigate back to camp. We set off immediately. Once back, we got the fire going, and James cracked open a bottle of Captain Morgan spiced rum. Over the course of the evening, we just about emptied the whole thing, thanks mostly to James and his generous pours. Just to clarify, all of our hunting gear was safely locked in the car, with ammunition secured separately as per NSW firearms regulations. Around 11:30 p.m., we decided to call it a night. We had to be up by 5:30 a.m. to get hunting before first light. That's when I noticed something strange. My swag was set up as I'd left it, but I could have sworn I placed my sleeping bag underneath the canvas flap. Yet there it was, still rolled up in its bag, sitting on one side of the tent. I figured I must have just thought I'd set it up earlier, probably the rum talking. So I shrugged it off, unrolled it, and got into bed. At 5:25 a.m., my alarm went off, cutting through my hangover like a knife. I hate mornings. My head was pounding, and I dry retched from the combination of exhaustion and too much rum the night before. Our plan was to get up early, go for a hunt, then come back, light the fire, and cook breakfast. We got ourselves ready and headed out. We'd already scouted the area and knew where we wanted to be before first light, thinking the deer might be feeding there around dawn. But as we arrived, we heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel engine droning somewhere nearby, just idling low and steady. We couldn't see it, but it sounded close. That pretty much ruined the hunt in that spot, so we moved on and tried another area. By the time we reached the next spot, it was around 6:15 a.m. We saw nothing, but oddly enough, we could still hear that same diesel engine humming somewhere nearby. It sounded just as close as it did before, even though we had walked quite a distance. At the time, we didn't think too much of it. It was a Saturday morning, and there were bound to be other hunters out here. But aside from Slim and that engine noise, we hadn't seen any trace of another soul. We eventually called it quits and headed back to camp for breakfast. And that's when things started to get strange. As we came back into camp, we saw the fire roaring. It wasn't just burning, it was stacked high with wood and blazing hot as if it had been lit for some time. That was impossible. We hadn't lit it that morning. In fact, the fire had gone out overnight. There weren't even warm embers left when we woke up. We'd been careful with our limited firewood, letting the fire die down before heading to bed the night before. James and I exchanged looks. Neither of us could explain it. We hadn't prepped the fire or stacked any wood before we left. We're not that organized. Then I remembered the rolled up sleeping bag from the night before. I rushed to my tent, unzipped it, and sure enough, the sleeping bag was rolled up again. But this time something else was off. My swag had been turned around. The open end, where the pillow goes, was now facing the front of the tent instead of the back. I knew for certain I hadn't done that. I shouted for James to come and check it out. I called again, and finally he answered, voice trembling. "Ah, Kevin, you might want to come check this out." I zipped up my tent, got to my feet, and walked over to the front of the car, where James was standing, staring at the windscreen of my 4x4. The frost was still thick on the glass. And there, written in the frost, were the words, "Stay warm but don't burn." At that moment, I lost it. "James, you prick, don't mess around like that. Not after the weird shit with the fire and my swag." But deep down, I knew he hadn't written it. The shock on his face was too real. If he had been playing a prank, he wouldn't have been able to keep a straight face this long. He always cracks up. I think part of me just wanted it to be a joke. I needed it to be a joke. But looking at him, it was clear. He wasn't joking. And as things unfolded, that would become undeniable. Right after my outburst, James turned to me and let out a scream. Not a startled, high-pitched one, but a deep, guttural roar that came from somewhere way down inside him. It wasn't just loud. It was raw, primal. He screamed for what felt like a full minute, though I'm sure it was only a few seconds. I jumped back instinctively. It scared the absolute shit out of me. Then, without saying a word, He ripped off his backpack, threw it on the ground, and stormed into the dense pine plantation next to us, disappearing into the trees. I was rattled. I've known James for over 10 years, and he's never acted like that before, not even close. But I didn't go after him. Maybe I should have. I just figured he needed space, time to breathe. I assumed it was the shock of everything that had just happened, plus whatever pressure he had going on at home or with his business. It had to be that. Still, I knew one thing for certain. There was no way we were staying there. Someone had found us and was seriously screwing with us, and I had no idea how far they'd go. I started thinking about packing up camp, already going through the checklist in my head. Then I glanced over at the fire, and something about it locked my attention completely. There was nothing strange about it at first glance. It was just a fire. But I felt drawn to it. I walked closer, the heat rolling onto my skin. Not that I needed the warmth. My body was still running on pure adrenaline from everything that had just happened. And yet I sat down, right there by the fire. I just sat and watched the flames. I chalked it up to a bit of shock. Not fear exactly, just a kind of mental fog. I wasn't frozen, but I couldn't think of anything else better to do. It was like I felt compelled to sit and watch the fire. I must have been there for 10 or 15 minutes when James came back. He didn't say a word, just sat down in his camp chair next to mine. The fire slowly died down to glowing embers. It was around 11:30 a.m. when I finally snapped out of the trance-like state I'd been in. That's when I heard it again. That diesel Ford engine in the distance, gradually getting louder. It grew louder still until it sounded like it was right on the road beside our camp. Both of us instinctively tilted our heads, listening closely, watching the direction the sound was coming from. We expected the vehicle to turn down our hidden little track, but it never did. It just rumbled past and eventually faded into the distance. Probably just another hunter or someone passing through. Diesel 4WDs are about as common in the bush as gum trees. By this point, I was fully alert and actually feeling a bit more grounded. I turned to James and asked how he was doing. He gave a half smile and said, "Fuck this guy. Who the fuck does he think he is? Trying to mess with us. Just because we don't live out in inbred country, he thinks he can screw with us and we'll just pack up and leave his precious little hunting ground?" He shook his head. "Well, fuck that. I ain't going nowhere." His anger surprised me. James has never been the confrontational type. He's not one to go looking for trouble, and definitely not someone who gets fired up easily. But after everything that had happened, someone clearly trespassing in our camp and deliberately messing with our stuff, I couldn't really blame him. Everyone knows the golden rule of camping. Unless someone needs help, you do not mess with another person's camp, especially when they're not around. It's a massive sign of disrespect, and in the wrong situation, it can earn you a serious beating. So I asked James if he wanted to move camp. Earlier, while sitting by the fire, I had been dead set on packing up and leaving. But now, strangely, that urgency had faded. I wasn't so worried anymore. "No," he said, rummaging through the esky. "Let's give it another night." He pulled out the bacon and eggs and started prepping breakfast, though at this point, it was well past morning and closer to lunch. I had started to rationalize everything, trying to make sense of what had happened and whether it was really that bad. I mean, my sleeping bag had been rolled up. We'd heard a vehicle in the distance, but never actually seen it. The fire was burning when we got back to camp. Someone had written "Stay warm but don't burn" in the frost on my windscreen. My bed had been tampered with. Yes, it was weird. The "stay warm" part made sense considering the fire had been lit. The bed thing was strange too, but not exactly threatening. The only part that felt truly unsettling was "don't burn." But was that a threat or a warning? I genuinely didn't know. After what was technically brunch, We sat and talked about what to do next. James suggested we just go about our day and see if anything else happened. He said it could have been some kids passing through, trying to scare us, and that maybe they'd already moved on. I hadn't told him yet about my sleeping bag being rolled up the night before, but at that point, I wasn't too fussed. I was strangely calm about everything now, not really scared, just a bit unsettled. I couldn't explain the shift in my mindset. When James stormed off earlier, I was dead set on packing up or at the very least moving to a new campsite. Now, I didn't really care. James said, "We'll stay just one more night." I agreed, suggesting we do a bit of exploring near camp, just to make sure we hadn't missed a cabin or stumbled into someone else's territory. So we stuck together and started looking around. There was nothing strange immediately around the camp. We followed the long, narrow clearing to one end, doubled back past our site, which was untouched, and then walked down to the opposite end. After returning, we decided to check out what was beyond the pine plantation. We carried our rifles with us, not just in case we spotted any deer, but also to keep them with us so no one could mess with or steal them. On the far side of the plantation, we found a beautiful clearing. It was circular, neatly enclosed on all sides, almost as if someone had deliberately cleared and mowed it. It looked oddly out of place, too manicured, too intentional. It didn't feel like something that naturally belonged there. As we stood there, wondering about the purpose of this odd little clearing, I suddenly heard a crashing sound on the far side, something big moving quickly through the underbrush. Instinctively, I raised my rifle, thinking it might be a deer, but what I saw was nothing like a deer. For just a second or two, I caught a glimpse of someone, blue jeans, work boots, taking 2 quick steps before vanishing into the thick scrub. I shouted, "Hey you, come back!" The only reply? A burst of maniacal giggling echoing through the trees. I glanced at James. He was already looking at me. I suggested we head back to camp. Whoever or whatever we'd seen might try to double back and mess with our stuff. We decided to return via a different route than the one we'd come in on. As we got close, we moved like we were stalking a deer. Quiet, careful, alert. Both of us had our rifles in hand, which struck me as odd. Normally, we'd have them slung over our shoulders. I guess we were on edge after everything that had happened. Camp slowly came into view. First the roof of the 4x4, then the top of my tent, and finally the full layout. Nothing looked out of place. The fire was gently smoldering its last bits of wood. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, and my tent hadn't been touched. I was still slightly freaked out, but James seemed calm, calmer than he'd been since the moment he stormed off into the bush. Curious, I asked him about it. "Why did you scream in my face and storm off earlier?" He looked at me, confused. "What the fuck are you on about? You're the one who yelled at me, and then you walked off." I felt my blood rise and snap back. "Mate, don't bullshit me. You screamed in my fucking face and took off down there," I said, pointing toward the pine plantation we had just walked through. "Like hell I did," he said. "I came over and sat at the fire after you had your little tanty." I just went quiet. I knew what had happened. I was sure of it. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts or the afterlife or any of that nonsense. But I also know what I saw. He walked off. I stayed at the fire. And now he was telling me the opposite? It didn't sit right. I told James we should pack up and leave before dark. We haven't seen a single deer or pig. We're wasting time just to be messed with by whoever the hell we saw in that clearing. But James wasn't having it. "Don't be a bitch, man. Nothing's happened. Let's just get our deer. I didn't come all this way to go home with an empty freezer." Maybe he had a point. I still wasn't convinced, but I figured maybe we were just stressed and clashing because of it. I went along with it. We stuck around camp for another hour, then geared up for one more hunt. This time, we headed straight down the road where our little side track branched off. At the bottom end of the forest, the pine plantation gave way to a wide clearing, which then merged into native gum scrub. I felt safer with my rifle in hand. I told myself that if anything happened, at least I had some form of defense. As we crossed the clearing, we came across what looked like some old sheds, remnants from what must have once been a farm. It looked like people camped there often, and now I remembered Slim pointing this spot out during his little tour. We walked up to the sheds for a closer look. Near one of them lay a dead wombat. It had clearly been there a while, though it wasn't giving off a smell, the winter cold likely keeping it preserved. Everything seemed relatively normal, so we moved on, heading down into the gully to sit out the last bit of daylight, hoping some deer might emerge to feed. But we saw nothing. A few kangaroos bounced by, and a wombat even waddled to within 5 meters of us. That was a good sign. We weren't scaring anything off. The animals had no clue we were even there. We decided to head back with what we thought was enough daylight to reach camp before dark. That's when things got properly weird. As we neared the sheds again, the wombat was gone. The one we'd seen earlier lying dead by the shed, it had been moved. You could clearly see the depression in the grass where it had been, but now it was just gone. James suddenly tensed up. "Come on, let's go back to camp," he said sharply. Without waiting for a response, he started marching off quickly in the direction of camp. He was walking so fast, I struggled to keep up. He didn't slow once the entire way back. I was always about 5 meters behind him. We got back to camp just as the last light faded. That's when we noticed the fire. It had been restacked with wood, and it reeked of diesel. Whoever had been here was clearly trying to light it in a hurry, and we must have interrupted them. James ignored the fire completely. He grabbed his headlamp and began scanning the camp, searching for something, though I didn't know what. I felt the need to do the same. My bed hadn't been touched, but James's swag had several pine cones arranged over it, in the shape of an arrow pointing directly toward the car. That was strange, but now there was no doubt. Someone had been here. I turned toward the vehicle. On the bonnet of my four-wheel was a small pool of liquid. Blood. Above it, hanging from a tree, was the wombat. Strung up by one of its back legs, it slowly spun in the cold, evening breeze. Its entrails were torn out, dangling about a meter below its upside-down head. The blood was dripping steadily from its guts onto the bonnet of my car. Then I saw something else, something stuffed into its mouth. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was a sock, one of mine. A black sock with blue on the heel and toes. I called out to James, and he came over and saw it, the wombat, hanging there. His reaction was immediate. He lost it. Out of a mix of rage and fear, he raised his rifle and started firing at the carcass, over and over. It was the first physical, undeniable evidence that someone else had been messing with us, the first thing neither of us could explain away. The first real proof that we were caught up in some psycho's twisted game. James shouted, "You were right. Let's pack up and get the fuck out of here." We slung our rifles over our shoulders and began frantically packing up camp. That's when we heard it again, the low drone of a diesel engine heading toward us. My heart rate jumped. I crept over to the track and crouched behind a tree, hoping to catch a glimpse of the vehicle, to confirm once and for all whether it was Slim. I quietly chambered a round into my rifle and waited. Faint beams of light began cutting through the trees. He's close, I thought. The vehicle was crawling, maybe 10 kilometers per hour, like the driver was scanning the bush, looking for something. Then it stopped, right in front of where I was hiding. My breath caught. I peeked around the tree and got a clear view. It was Slim. No doubt about it. He hadn't seen me, though. He had the interior light on, looking down at something in his lap. Then, calmly, he raised what looked like a cigarette to his lips, licked the side, stuck it in his mouth, and lit it. A moment later, he gunned it, slammed the accelerator, and took off. By the time I lost sight of him, He had to be doing at least 60 kilometers per hour. Did he know I was there? Why did he stop exactly where I was hiding? I didn't have time to think about it. I raced back to camp. James had nearly everything packed. His swag, my swag, and most of the gear were already loaded in the back of the truck. Only the tent and his tarp were left. Then we heard the diesel again. But this time, there were no lights, just the growl of the engine in the dark. Then came the voice. "You better leave right now, boys. You don't want to get burnt. Leave now or burn, ha ha. Leave now or burn, leave now or burn, ha ha." Over and over, the voice echoed through the trees, shouting and laughing like a deranged chant. We didn't even think. We threw everything else aside, left the tent, left the tarp, didn't care anymore. We jumped into the 4-wide and floored it toward what we hoped was the exit to the forest. We got bloody lost, again. I drove for about 45 minutes, pushing the 4-body as fast as I could without risking a crash. We had no clue where we were, just trying to get out of that nightmare of a forest. Then, out of nowhere, we saw something we didn't expect: rural fire service trucks. Relieved, I honked the horn to get their attention, but they didn't stop. They just kept driving. Given how lost we were, we figured the smartest move was to follow them. Surely they could lead us out or at least point us in the right direction. So we tailed the 2 trucks, keeping a careful distance. And then, to our absolute disbelief, they drove straight back to our campsite. And there, already waiting for them, was Slim's ute. We froze. Didn't know what the hell to do. But seeing 6 firefighters there gave us a bit of confidence. At least there were others around now. So we pulled up and walked down the track toward what had been our camp. What we saw stopped us cold. The whole campsite was ablaze. My tent was gone, reduced to a melted black pile on the ground. The trees where James's tarp had been tied up were burning. The fireys were already well into extinguishing the fire by the time we got close. Once they had it mostly under control, the fire chief turned his attention on us. He came in hot. "Why didn't you put your fire out before you bloody left?" he barked. "If it wasn't for Slim radioing it into HQ, the whole bloody forest could have gone up." He glared at us. "Fucking city wankers coming out here without a clue. Don't ever come back. You're not welcome out here again." I looked over at Slim, rage boiling in my chest. He met my stare with a twisted look, mouthing the words, "Don't say a fucking word." His expression was so full of hate, so intense, I could have sworn I heard him whisper, "Burn, you cunts." No one else reacted, so maybe I imagined it. But later, James would tell me he thought he heard it too. That was enough for us. We didn't argue. We didn't defend ourselves. Slim had gotten under our skin so deeply, we just stood there, taking the blame, knowing full well we were being set up and not wanting to find out what else he was capable of. The fireys eventually put out the last of the flames and, though clearly unimpressed, said we could follow them out. They guided us back toward Oberon. We rolled into town late that night around 9 p.m. and checked into the local pub, which had rooms to let. Exhausted and still shaken, we just wanted some rest. But as we walked back to the car to grab some clothes, we saw the last person we ever wanted to see again, Slim. He was leaning against the side of the street, rolling a smoke with a beer can resting on the bonnet of his ute. We stopped dead in our tracks. He looked up at us from under his brow, locking eyes with a sick, twisted grin spreading across his face. Then he started laughing, that same maniacal giggling we'd heard echoing through the clearing in the forest. We didn't say a word. We didn't go back inside. We didn't even return the room key. We just got in the car and drove straight back to Sydney. A few days later, we mailed the key back to the pub. It wasn't until we were unpacking our gear that we found something else. Inside a spare pair of boots I'd brought along, there was a note. It read, "Feeling hot? See you next time, boys." I still don't know exactly what happened. I don't know what we did to trigger Slim, or even who Slim really is. But there was something deeply wrong about that whole weekend, something we still can't explain. To this day, James and I both have nightmares about it, recurring, relentless. And every time I see a four-wad like Slim's, I feel this chill run down my spine. My hands shake. It's like I'm back there again. What's strangest, though, and maybe most disturbing, is that both of us have talked about going back. We feel drawn to the place. Both of us, like something is pulling at us. We've made a pact. If we ever return, we go together, never alone. But we're trying to fight the urge. So, does anyone have any thoughts? Any idea why James still insists to this day that I was the one who walked off after we came back to that lit fire and the frost message? He swears it happened that way. No matter how many times we talk about it, I'd really love some answers. Because right now, I have none. But I can't shake this feeling that I need to go back. Should we?